Today, we look at the continuing fallout from the Danny Masterson sentencing. We take a very hard line in discussing Scientology's key fixers and enablers. And the Greek Orthodox Church warns Greek citizens about the dangers of Scientology and its front groups. All of this and more on today's episode of After Scientology, Straight Up and Vertical. Stay tuned. Hello, welcome to After Scientology, Straight Up and Vertical, the weekly show where Tony Ortega and I cover the week's events as reported on the world of Scientology on Tony's blog. So, hey, Tony, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Chris, thanks for having me back, man.
Absolutely, yeah. We got some things to talk about. This week was interesting. Of course, the first thing we should lead with is fallout from the Masterson case. This continues to roll out on social media. We've seen Ashton and Mila just absolutely trolled. I'm just dragged, on this, and a lot of very, very pissed off people out there about that whole thing. You guys did a podcast on this week. What are your thoughts about all of this now?
Well, last week when we talked, we knew that the letters had caused quite a controversy and that Ashton and Mila had addressed it in this sort of bizarre POW video.
Yep.
And you and I talked about that. Since then, of course, the fallout has continued, and Ashton and Mila have actually resigned from the nonprofit victim advocacy organization that he founded.
Right.
So this has really become a big issue for him.
Yeah.
Since then, the things that have happened was, I think I mentioned that when Megan Cuniff and I made those letters public Friday morning, we had a file that was it was complete, but it was hard to reproduce in parts. Like there were some letters that were cut off and stuff, and I didn't want to make them public if I couldn't make them, complete. So what's happened since then was I went back and I got those letters, including Ethan Suplee's and letters from Carol Masterson, Peter Masterson, and Christopher Masterson, Danny's mother, father, and younger brother. That did not kick up quite as big of a controversy, but I'd still like to see somebody ask Ethan Suplee about it. I would say the biggest difference between him and Ashton and Mila is, first of all, he's not as big a star, obviously, but he is a Scientologist. And Ashton and Mila are not. So I'm just curious, Ethan has been getting a lot of publicity in recent months for his weight loss and what incredibly great shape he's in.
Yeah.
It'd be nice to see if somebody asked him about writing a letter for Danny Masterson. So that's happened since you and I talked.
Right.
And then the other thing was that the victim impact statements, this is what we were really paying attention to on Thursday at the sentencing hearing. Mm-hmm. And I was fortunate, I had some people in there that were taking detailed notes for me, but detailed notes are not exact. And I wanted as close to exactly what these women said. So over about this time last week, I had paid for and received a transcript from the hearing. And so that's as close as you're going to get to not being there. And so I put together for Tuesday morning, the 3 impact statements and also what Judge Olmedo had said. Mm-hmm. And let me tell you, that had a huge effect on my readers. They were just blown away at the bravery of these 3 women, the things they said, the way they characterized that, yeah, Danny Masterson may be facing a long sentence in prison, but they've been in prison themselves for years because of what he did to them. Mm-hmm. So very powerful statements. So glad to get those out and as complete as possible. So, and then it's just been constantly in the news ever since then. And I it's bounced around the world. I was on 60 Minutes Australia talking about the same thing. I think people coming out of that trial, the number one question I get is, what's the effect on Scientology? I said, look, Scientology really got exposed in this thing. Mm-hmm. And these letters have raised the profile even higher. When is the government going to do something, Chris? I mean, as I said to 60 Minutes, it's like the government has never had things served on a platter to them the way they have in this case. You've got victims, you've got evidence, You've got clearly some kind of a racketeering obstruction of justice going on with the Church of Scientology. You've got witnesses. I mean, what more does the government need?
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. I mean, been at this for a long time, been waiting for a long time, and heard this, heard that, heard the other thing, including grand jury. And I'm not even poo-pooing these things. I'm just, okay, so, where does all this go? Like, it's been years.
Right.
So it's time. It's time. It's time to make this happen. Speaking of which, this kind of rolls over into the next thing I wanted to talk to you about from your articles this week in terms of crimes and covered up crimes. Julian Schwartz. Now, you want to talk about somebody who has been one of the real key players in a low-key, behind-the-scenes, nobody knows this guy kind of way. Well, this is Julian Schwartz, and this guy has been on, let's just say, cleaner, fixer lines for Scientology for many, many years, and he's still at it. You had published an article back in, 2015?
Yeah, so I've been hearing about this guy for years, that he was this enforcer, maybe not as bombastic and crazy as Marty Rathbun, but the same sort of thing where he made David Miscavige's worst punishments happen.
Yep.
And I got the opportunity several years ago to talk to some people that were involved in this daycare center, where just very clear that a Scientologist teenager at his mother's Scientology daycare had been molesting little girls. And this Julian Schwartz made sure that all the mothers of these victimized girls reported to police, but did not press charges.
Right.
They want, and the excuse was, if you press charges against this young man, they'll end up giving him psych meds, right? And so that would be worse than anything he could experience. He ended up, his punishment, Chris, was to babysit for these families.
Oh,
after molesting the children, his punishment was to babysit for them. So I got that story, and there were a number of people that wanted to see this story done. It had been very frustrating for them. They had gone to reporters. The problem was that the police weren't talking about it. There was no, it was handled as a juvenile manner, so there's no court record you could get your hands on.
Right.
I finally was able to do it because I did get a member of law enforcement off the record to confirm what I had heard. So once I had that, I felt, okay, I can write a story. I'm not going to be able to name some people. I didn't use Julian Schwartz's last name at that point. There had not been court testimony about him at that point. I obviously didn't name the mother of the victim. I didn't name the young man who was molesting the children. I had to be careful because you have to understand, I didn't have the court papers with names listed in them where I could do that. But it was still a story that I think people were very interested in. I know Leah Remini told me she felt it was very important that story get done then. Another person I heard from was Lisa Marie Presley. She called me after that story came out and thanked me and told me how important it was to her that came out. And that was one of our conversations that I ended up writing about recently. So, since then, of course, I keep hearing about Julian Schwartz, especially in the Danny Masterson case, because he was one of the ethics people that was re-victimizing these victims, punishing these victims, making sure Danny wasn't, going to suffer any consequences. And you have to understand, when I wrote that story 8 years ago, I remember I had to get cartoons to illustrate it because I not only couldn't use pictures of the actual parents, obviously, I couldn't find a picture of Julian Schwartz. I looked everywhere. I asked people that knew him. I think I ended up getting a picture of his brother or something. It was very frustrating. All right, so 8 years goes by. We're now in the second trial for Danny Masterson. Julian Schwartz is being mentioned time and time again. And one of the things, I don't know if you remember from my coverage, but one of the things the DA's office did much better in the second trial than the first trial was much better visual aids.
Mm.
They had great slides they showed. They showed these women in ways that were really sympathetic and really powerful. And at one point, they're talking about Julian Schwartz, and boom, they show that photo. And I'm like, that's the photo I've been looking for a decade. And, you're in court. You can't take a picture of a picture. There was nothing I could do at that point. So I was just like, wow, I wish I had that picture. Well, now Leah Remini and Yashar Ali have gotten their hands on that picture, and they released it Saturday night. And once they and in the piece they wrote together, they mentioned my daycare story.
Mm.
So I thought, okay, yes, thank you. Let me remind people what that story is all about. So I republished that story on Sunday to show how horrible it was, that what these people were going through. And Julian Schwartz was corralling everybody, making sure that law enforcement knew about it, but no charges were going to be pressed. I mean, just scummy behavior. And I reached, and the woman, the one mother that wanted to press charges more publicly, she was the main subject of my story. I called her Ellen. I called her up yesterday. And I said, I don't know if you've seen this, but Julian Schwartz is in the news. And she says, you're not going to believe it, but there's been some updates I wanted to give you. So by the time this video comes out, Chris, you'll see our update. There's some really interesting new twists in that story with Ellen and her daughter and this whole Julian Schwartz story. So thank you, Leah and Yashar, for making that picture finally public. We can talk about this guy in a more public way. We can talk about him more because he's been the subject of court testimony. And, I think he's been a key player in us, covering up crime going on in the Church of Scientology. And you knew him, right?
I did. In fact, even if I didn't know any of this reporting, I know this guy, and I would have described him exactly as you just said, because from my view now, I get what he was up to. And he flat out told me 2 or 3 times as I was going over there to coordinate different things with him, having to do with staff or public or situations at the Advanced Organization of Los Angeles. That's where he works. It's one of the big blue buildings. And he's ostensibly posted as an ethics officer in that organization. But as he told me many times, he works for RTC. There is an RTC office in that building, and that's where they have their local representative, what's called the PAC RTC rep. And that person dictates orders to all kinds of people on that base. And that's a direct line from Miscavige to that office to Julian Schwartz.
Wow.
And he told me that himself 2 or 3 times. Okay. So there's no question in my mind that anything on his plate, especially involving celebrities, is going right over to that office and going right up the line on a daily basis. And that is how he was run. He said, I'm run daily by these guys.
Right.
So it was, at the time, it was frustrating for me because I was trying to get him to do his actual job. Now I see, oh, no, I get what's going on. They just take certain trusted staff. Yeah. And I'm sure this is true at every Sea Org base. This has to be true. That you'll have these fixer types who will go in and clean stuff up. And this whole story you posted from 2015 is an example of their day-to-day job. And they were going off base all the time. They had e-meters with them, sometimes going out doing ethics interviews. It doesn't just happen inside the church buildings. Sometimes they'll go do home visits.
Yeah.
So that's what I can speak to in terms of my direct experience with this guy. And this is nasty, nasty business. It just bothers me. I feel slimed in a way because even as I suspected he was up to handling maybe squirrels or, nasty elements who were getting around the church. That's kind of my view at the time. I had no idea what he was doing. To know that he was doing this kind of stuff is sickening because this is so grossly criminal against children.
Yeah.
And he didn't care. What he cared about was Scientology doesn't get smeared in the media, and those kids can be sacrificed for that cause.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
like you're one step off of radicalization and violence at that point. I mean, this is really, really bad. So I would love to see that guy get on the stand at some point. That would be, oh, the that would be great.
I'm sure the grand jury that's been working for 5 years knows all about him.
Yeah, I'll bet they do.
When are they going to haul him in?
Exactly.
To get Miscavige?
That's right.
That's
right. Because the dots are right there. I mean, we're talking about 2 stages of, a separation at that point. You're so close to actual Miscavige there.
Right. Good point.
Yeah. So okay. I just got. Sometimes I get a little riled up about this stuff. Now, also speaking of, and right in line with this, was another report you put up that I wanted to kind of talk about for a second. This absolute sleaze PI. It came across so clearly in his testimony. I was like, oh my God, this guy. What was that about?
Yeah, so we've been writing about this guy for a long time. His name is Yanti Michael Green. He is now, once he got sued, he changed it to Michael Moretti Ford Cruz and disappeared down in Louisiana. But he's a retired New York Police Department detective who, like other retired law enforcement types, gets more income also doing private investigative work. And he was working for this guy named Dan Ribicoff and his company IIG, an International Investigative Group or something. And IIG, the more I learned about it, they were Scientology's main PI firm on the East Coast. Didn't know that originally. Now we do. But they in 2017, Leah was either doing, I think maybe, if you remember, when she did her first season of Scientology in the Aftermath, Miscavige was a little quiet about it. But as soon as they announced the second season, he went nuts. And there was just all this fair game aimed at her. And I think it was around then she was making a movie with Jennifer Lopez, and she was in Manhattan filming it.
That's right. Yeah.
And I got a tip from somebody that knew who this Yanti Green was and went up to him and said, "What are you doing?" And Yanti told my source, "Oh, I'm following Leah Remini for the Church of Scientology." Now, the only reason why he would say that in that way was he was bragging. He felt that this made him a big man, right? Oh, I'm following Leah Remini for the Church of Scientology. I'm supposed to follow her 12 hours a day for the next 2 weeks. That got back to me. I got his phone number. I called him up. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about. Okay. But don't you drive a white van with Texas plates? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So that was in 2017. I wrote that story. Then a few years later, he was sued in this crazy lawsuit because this wealthy couple had split up. The husband was suspicious of his ex. The husband hired IIG to follow her. And the 3 or 4 IIG private investigators, including Yanti Green, did more than just surveil her. They befriended her. They hung out with her. They had sex with her.
Unbelievable.
Incredible. And she is saying that at 2:00 in the morning in May 2018 or whatever, she found herself in the back of Yanti Green's car being raped by him. And so the husband and wife reconciled, realized what they had done to her, and also he claimed that IIG had double billed him. And so the two of them have been suing IIG and these investigators for years now. And they have a really good legal team. And at one point, they actually got Yanti's texts from the cloud. He lost his iPhone, but they managed to get his texts from the cloud in a court order. And it right there shows him stalking Leah Remini, talking about how Scientology wants her dead and all this stuff. That's when I got involved. They contacted me And they said, "Are you this Tony Ortega they're talking about in these texts?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, I remember these guys, these clowns." And that's when I started writing for the Daily Beast about what was in these texts. They were these private investigators were obviously following Leah Remini and Jennifer Lopez around Manhattan. So I had that story about the texts and Scientology, but I'm also interested in, did this guy rape this woman or not? I mean, it's so bizarre because she claims she's completely out of it. He's drugged her or something. She's in the back of his car. He's filming himself attacking her, but when they sue him and come to court, he submits like 30 seconds of video and says, "No, look, Judge, she was raping me." Now, I've been in court with these people, Chris. We're talking about a 5'2" woman,
right,
who's about 50 years old, and a 6'5" linebacker-looking former New York police detective, trying to convince us all that she raped him.
Right.
Well,
right.
He's just been hammered in court because the Smiths got an expert who got the rest of his footage from the cloud.
Perfect.
And showed that not only was he saying things like, "Get ready, here it comes," but that he had cut out all that incriminating footage and had just submitted a small part to the court to fool the court. Court didn't like that. The judge found him in contempt of court, fined him $300,000. But I got to tell you, Chris, to this point now, this former New York police detective has faced no real criminal charges for assaulting a woman, taping himself doing it, covering it up. I mean, it's just incredible. That's what blows my mind is there's no justice in Nassau County.
Wow.
And cops can do whatever the hell they want.
This is disgusting.
So the lawsuits keep going, and now they've gotten to the point they're doing depositions. And so the Smiths, their attorneys, got to question Yanti, Michael Green, Michael Moretti, Ford Cruz for 6 or 7 hours. And they didn't have to. Their lawsuit is about what he did to her. The Leah Remini Scientology thing is completely separate. But thankfully, they asked him about that for a few minutes. And I got a hold of that footage. And so you get to see him squirming as they're asking him about following Leah Remini. He says he was. Was it for the Church of Scientology? I believe so. And, he doesn't say anything all that crazy. But I just, how often, Chris, do we get a Scientology private investigator under oath?
Right.
And talking about stalking somebody for the church. So I figured people would want to see that.
Absolutely. And and I want to highlight from my end of things something important, I think, for people to understand, because a lot of people get really, like, and me included, who are these people that Scientology hires? How do they find these people? And obviously, no joke, they obviously go down to the sewer. And they find, the sleaziest sleazes who probably work for bottom dollar or something. I mean, that must be the appeal. And of course, because they're willing, and maybe they pay top dollar, but because these are the people who are willing to do whatever you tell them to do.
Right.
Right. As we saw even with those two goons with the, plastic homemade silencers and all of that, stalking Ron Miscavige Sr. back
right.
Years ago.
Right.
Just sleazebag people.
Yeah.
And as one person pointed out to me who was in law enforcement when I was talking to him about this, he said, "Yeah, why do you think they're retired? Why do you think they didn't just live out on their pension? Because they're scumbags who got kicked off."
Yeah.
So anyway, just worth commenting on this, because this is all part and parcel of Scientology's operations, guys. These are foot soldiers for Scientology.
I mean, it's just more evidence showing that what we have been saying for decades is the case, that this is what Scientology does. I mean, how much evidence does the government need that they're going to hire people like this to do dirty shit?
Right.
Because that's what they do.
That's right. All right. We had a couple more to take a look at here, moving on, because just talk about that all day. Now, there was a loss in the Scientology world this week. A whale Doug Doring?
Right. I've been writing about Doug Doring for quite a few years. He became famous in the '90s because he took over Neopets and made it a huge success. On his website, it says he created it. He didn't create it. He took it over, but he did make it a huge success. And you still see articles come up every once in a while talking about Neopets and Scientology. I don't think there's any Scientology in Neopets,
Mm-hmm.
but it was definitely owned by a Scientologist who made a lot of money from it. After that, he created this company called Age of Learning, and its main product is this thing, ABC Mouse. And that also has made him a huge amount of money. And again, I will say, I don't think there's any Scientology in ABC Mouse, but thanks to the success of Neopets and ABC Mouse, Doug Doring had been able to give $20 million to the IAS and another $10 million to the L. Ron Hubbard Hall. And I mean, I would tell people, I said, look, if you're a parent and you're paying ABC Mouse, they're $50 a month or whatever for your toddler, you just have to assume some of that money's going to David Miscavige. I'm sorry. And they get really angry at me and said, no, there's no Scientology in it. I'm thinking, well, look, where do you think Doug Doring gets his money that he gives to Scientology?
Right.
So and he's the father of actor Jason Doring from Veronica Mars, who himself is a Scientologist and has been used as a recruiter for Scientology. And I hadn't heard anything about him for a couple of years. And then this week, I got an email from somebody who claimed to be an employee at Age of Learning, and they forwarded to me a message from the CEO announcing that Doug had died.
Mm.
And I was very tempted to go with it right away, but I thought, I'm going to wait a little bit and see if I can't get some second level of confirmation. I don't want to be wrong. And so I waited until mid-morning. I called Age of Learning, asked them about memorial plans for Doug. They said, I'm sorry, we don't have anything additional to say. And that confirmed the story for me. So that's when I went ahead and published the story that day. And look, I know that Lori, his wife, may continue to give these sums. I know that some of his kids are still pretty dedicated, but it's got to concern Miscavige that he's losing this key whale right at a time when things are very difficult for him, when he's caught up in litigation with Leah Remini, when he's evading process servers. He doesn't need this. So I just thought it was interesting to point out that one of Scientology's biggest donors died in his 60s as an OT. That's not supposed to happen, but it does all the time.
Yes, he very uncausatively dropped his body, I suppose. There's a thing about this as well, which is, those figures you touted, while huge, I'm going to, remind everybody that's only what we know about.
Right.
Right. It's not like there's we know about this from member status reports from the IAS books and stuff.
Right. We know that he gave IAS about 20 million and L. Ron Hubbard Hall 10 million, but he probably also was a multiple humanitarian for various ideal org projects. There's probably several more million. He was hit up for book programs. He was hit up for, probably helping people with their bridge. I mean, there's just so many ways a wealthy Scientologist can be drained.
Oh, absolutely. And if he goes back to the 90s, then he was being drained as early as the superpower building and, the restoration of the tech projects and all the other nonsensical things they come up with to give him an excuse to take your money. Okay, so fair enough on that. And then finally, and this was one I wanted to end on an up note on this one, and this is I think this is good. The Greek Orthodox Church's statement about Scientology. What's the story on this one?
Yeah, so that happened a little while ago. I saw a note about that just on the ticker that the Greek Orthodox Church was recommending to stay away from Scientology. And I just thought, Chris Owen, wonderful historian in England, has written about Scientology and specifically about Greece. He's written about Greece for me several times, and I knew he knew the background. And so I just asked him, could you place this most recent statement in context of what we know about Scientology in Greece? And of course, it's Chris Owen. It's beautiful. It's well researched. It's well put together. It's complete. It's thorough. And I was just really glad he did. It took me a little while to get it on the site because there was so much Danny Masterson news breaking. But I'm glad I eventually got it up there. And I think people were really impressed by that. And I don't know. You had some thoughts about that?
Well, I did. I just thought that it was for a church. We're so used to the Scientology world and the cult over the top, hyperbolic crazy that comes out of David Miscavige's mouth and comes out as a Scientology press release. And you think, well, that's crazy. Churches don't usually talk like that. And so to see this statement and a couple of the quotes from it, I just thought I'd share these because this is a real church coming out about as forcefully as I think you're going to come out. I mean, punch on the nose, right? Like this is it talks about Scientology and it talks about drug rehab and how they support drug rehab, but they say at the same time, it calls on the public, social, and private bodies active in the sensitive area of drug rehabilitation not to become unwitting sponsors or promoters of a religious organization with socially dangerous activities. Socially dangerous? What? Right? Its polemic and aversion to the medical branch of psychiatric science is, after all, well known. That's totally nails it. And they actually mention that twice. They end off medically, socially, and morally dangerous and harmful practices. That's how they have characterized Scientology, and they hit the nail on the head. And I like it because I really like when we see these sort of unprompted statements out of judges, out of royal commissions, and out of churches that nail Scientology for exactly what it is. And so you go, okay, good. Some people out there really do get this, and that is awesome.
Right. No, that was I wrote the headline, and my headline was, why don't we see this more often?
Yeah.
And I don't understand why more churches don't come forward and say, look, this is a criminal organization pretending to be a religion, but that's what Scientology spends so much time on their safe pointing, is trying to convince other religious organizations, don't mess with us, because if they come after us, they're going to come after you too.
That's right.
I think that's the subtle message they're telling other churches.
I agree. I'm sure that's the case, because that would be the only way they could get that interfaith common denominator sort of thing, because otherwise Scientology's got nothing in common with these guys, with these other churches.
Right.
So, yeah. All right. Well, those were the stories I wanted to address this week. I thought we had a good week. I thought there was, I think Scientology is still in public awareness out there. I think the Masterson things are still going to probably continue to roll out for another week or two at least until we see something else happen. But any previews of anything coming up this week?
Just, it's just been an incredible 2 weeks for the bunker, and lots of new people. And I've got some real good stuff cooking. So, I mean, like I said, the immediate thing is make sure you see the update on the daycare story. And then other stuff coming after that. It just never ends, man.
No, it is. Scientology is the gift that keeps on giving. As far as what we do. All right, folks out there, thank you very much for coming around and listening as always. Subscribe to Tony's Substack if you have not. The address is right there on the screen, and you will get daily notifications on these things. And this is interesting and topical news. And then, of course, subscribe to my channel as well. I will see you next week. Bye-bye.